Response is sung each time the red R is printed. Bill will lead us in the first response. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so longs my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God. With shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, whom again I shall praise, my help and my God. My soul is cast down within me, therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from the Mount Mizar. He calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night God's song is with me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I mourn because of the oppression of the enemy? Like a deadly wound in my body, my adversaries taunt me. They say to me continually, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you disquieted within me? Hope in God, whom again I shall praise, my help and my God. The scripture reading comes from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 15. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stone and a jar of water. He ate and drank and laid down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that time, he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are trying to kill me too." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? Now let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Well, it's good to be back with you this week. We had fun at annual conference. We'll talk about that a little bit as we move on. And I am so grateful to Lee for stepping up and stepping in. I know you were blessed by him because I listened to the DVD of his sermon, and I was blessed by it as well. I'm so glad that he's willing to do that again for us sometime. When I realized that we were going to have this little Sunday stuck in the middle of nowhere, Lee had preached last week. Alma will be preaching next week when I'm on vacation. She's on vacation this week. I said to myself, well, what am I going to do with one Sunday? You know, I'm a series preacher, and we start a series, and then we do 4 or 5 weeks together, and everyone builds on the other one. And here was this Sunday, it was just hanging out here all by itself. So I went to the lectionary, which I did at the beginning of my time as a pastor, but I haven't done it in a long time. The lectionary is the assigned readings for the week. And your previous pastor used that all the time, I think, and both of them. And here was this wonderful passage about Elijah. It's one of my favorites in the whole Bible. In fact, Elijah is one of my favorite characters. And when I started thinking about the events that unfolded at conference and this scripture, that there was a rightness to it, I think, that we're going to unpack together. I wasn't real sure what it was going to be about until we did go to annual conference, but we'll see if there's some meat here for you. Elijah is revered throughout the whole Old Testament. Elijah is such a major figure. In the New Testament, when Jesus is transfigured in front of a few of his disciples, the people that appear with him are Moses and Elijah. That's the kind of stature this prophet has in the Holy Scriptures. And Jewish persons still revere Elijah and expect maybe that he will come back because he didn't die. He was whisked up into heaven. And as his mentee Elisha watched, Elijah was taken up into heaven. So every time a Jewish family celebrates Passover, which we did in my family for quite a number of years when our children were little, because my husband was Jewish, that's why we were doing that. We would set a table place for Elijah. There would be a chair for Elijah. There would be a plate and everything for Elijah, and a glass of wine for Elijah. And there's a point in the ritual where someone goes and opens the door, and you leave it open in order that Elijah might have an easier time coming in if Elijah decides to visit that night. Also in the ritual, there's this thing that you do with children. There's a time in the ritual where you break a matzo into those hard crackers into 3 pieces. Each signifies something. You take the middle piece, you wrap it up in a napkin, and somebody hides it for the kids. That's called the afikomen. And there comes a point in the ritual where you send the children off to find the afikomen. And while they are away, an adult at the table makes sure that Elijah's wine is all taken care of so that there's no more wine there. And the kids come back and everybody says, I think Elijah came. And they look and behold, the cup is empty. It's a wonderful ritual for a wonderful prophet of God. Almost every time you see Elijah in the Old Testament, you see deeds of power and the greatness of God becoming real as he preached and prophesied and carried out symbolic acts. And that's one reason that this particular text is so unusual. It shows Elijah in a whole different spirit, a whole different place. Elijah, at the beginning of chapter 19 of 1 Kings, is undone. He's undone by the threats of a woman. And he's so undone that he's really devastated. He falls under a broom tree and he says, take my life, Lord, I'm done. And that's surprising enough in itself, but when you realize where he has just been and what has just happened, it's just incredible. Because in chapter 18, the events really of the prior day, or a day very, very close in time to this one, are described. And you would just not recognize Elijah in these 2 chapters. In chapter 18 of 1 Kings, right before this bit that you just heard read, Elijah goes to King Ahab and says, you're messing up big time. You're worshiping the gods of Baal, not the one true God. And the gods of Baal were also the gods of Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And so Elijah said to Ahab, I'm going to meet you on the top of Mount Carmel, and we're going to settle once and for all who the true God is. And he says, you can bring 450 prophets of Baal with you. And so Ahab comes and he brings 450 prophets of Baal. That's on one side of Mount Carmel. On the other side stands Elijah, all by himself. And he challenges them. He says, we're going to sacrifice to our God and we're going to find out who the one true God is. So they brought 2 bulls. One was for the prophets of Baal. He says, you prepare your sacrifice here, but you have to call on your God to light the fire. And he says, then I'll do the same thing. So they take the bull and they kill it and they cut it up and they arrange a big pile of wood and they put the bull on top of it and they begin calling out to their gods, all 450 of them, calling for fire from heaven. And it goes on for so long that Elijah starts to taunt them and he says, well, has he gone on vacation? What happened to your God? I mean, where is he? And they call, and that causes them to gash themselves so that they intensify their experience and they're dripping blood everywhere and they're raving on and nothing happens. Either their God can't hear them or doesn't care or can't do anything about it. And then it's Elijah's turn. And he rebuilds the altar. He puts 12 stones in there, one for every one of the tribes of Israel, lays the wood on top of it, kills the bull, puts the pieces on top of it. It's all ready. And then he calls for 4 jars of water to be brought. Now, we're not talking this size. We're talking this size. I mean, many, many gallons of water. And the people bring the water, and he says, pour it all over. And they pour it all over, the bull, the wood, everything. It starts to run down into the little ditch on the sides. And then he says, do it again. And they do. And he says, do it again, and they do. So that by the time they're done, these 12 jars of water have been poured on. Everything is waterlogged. I mean, it is wet. The little ditch on the side is full of water. And then he prays a simple prayer. And fire falls from heaven that is so hot that it consumes everything. The bull is gone, the wood is gone, the stones are gone, the dust is gone, the water is gone. There is nothing left. Proving that the one true God is the God of Israel. And then he takes the 450 prophets of Baal and takes them into a wadi and kills them, every one by himself, barehanded. And then he says to Ahab, go on back into Jezreel, and that's 17 miles away. And then he himself sets out after Ahab has set out and runs so fast all the way to Jezreel, 17 miles, that he's in front of Ahab's chariot all the way. When you read this chapter that we just read, that's what happened yesterday. Isn't that weird? So yesterday there was this incredible miracle, power of God being invoked by Elijah, the mighty prophet. And then Ahab goes home and tells his wife Jezebel what happened, and she sends a little threat to Elijah and says, man, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be like those prophets of Baal. And he caves 100%. He falls apart at the threat of this woman. He runs far enough away to be safe momentarily, falls under a broom tree, and is begging God to take his life, saying, they're after me, they're going to take my life. Take me, I'm done. He's devastated. God doesn't take his life. God sends ministering angels, and the angels come and they bring food, and Elijah eats and drinks and rests and eats and drinks, and then he goes in the power of that food 40 days and 40 nights, a very long time, a very long way, to the holy mountain of God, Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, which is where Moses received the tablets from God. It's a very holy place. But he's not there to worship. He's there to hide. And he goes in a cave, and he pulls the world in after him until God shows up. And God shows up. God, who knows all things and never really needs to ask anything, God shows up and asks Elijah this penetrating question. God already knows the answer. That's the thing, something to keep in mind. But Elijah needs to hear the question, because hearing the question will help him put himself back together. And here's the question. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? It's such a penetrating question when I read it. This story has nothing to do with me, and it feels like it's for me. What are you doing here, Deborah? And no matter what's going on, I find myself stopped in my tracks. What are you doing here? And there's always something that I need to look at when I hear that question. Well, Elijah just gives an excuse. It sounds like a legitimate excuse because his life really is threatened. He says, I'm all by myself and they're trying to kill me. And it makes a lot more sense if you don't know what happened before, but God has just been with him in this mighty way. Why would he be worried about his life? They're coming to kill me, basically, he says. I think that question, God asked that question. Sometimes we think God wasn't listening for the answer, but God was listening for the answer. God comes with that question. It's not an accusation. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to look at where you are, how you got there, where you need to be. And Elijah is so undone, that's all he can do is give an excuse. It's often all I can do is give an excuse. Well, a lot of stuff's been going on, God, and that's why I'm here. That's why. He gives this excuse, and then God listens and responds by giving Elijah what he needs. He gives him this series of really miracles. A wind that is so strong that it's splitting rocks and mountains. I've never seen a wind like that. I've never read about a wind like that. Can you imagine what that would take? A mighty wind. Then there's an earthquake, and I have been through those, and I don't ever want to do that again, thank you. If I never go through another earthquake, that'll be fine with me. And then there's a fire. And all of those things often are portents of the presence of God. They are signs that God is present in that thing, in the wind. But in this instance, God was not in the wind, God was not in the earthquake, and God was not in the fire. And after all of that hullabaloo settled down, there was this silence that was so deep that you could hear it. Have you ever been in a place that quiet? A silence so deep that you could hear it. Sometimes after a week with my son, when he goes back to his dad's house, I go back to the house and I sit down, and it feels like that. I can hear the silence. This deep, deep silence, and that's when God speaks. And how does God speak? God says, again, that penetrating question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And again, it's not an accusation. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to say, why am I here? Why am I here? If I were Elijah, I'd be thinking all kinds of things, you know. Have I lost confidence in God? Did I forget? Did I forget that God took care of me? Did I forget that God showed up when I called on God? What, you know, all of those things would be in that moment for me. What are you doing here, Elijah? And in that silence and in that question, Elijah's heart is healed. And he is strengthened so that God knows that he's ready for his next assignment. And God gives Elijah his next assignment, and off Elijah goes strengthened to face whatever the world brings to him. It's a wonderful story. I invite you to go home and read it a few times, and I invite you to spend some time with that question. What are you doing here, Cindy? What are you doing here, Ken? What are you doing here, Brenda? I mean, it's such a good question. It's hard to make a connection between the kind of fear that Elijah had, that fear for his life, and anything that happens to me, or really anything that happens to the church. So what's the connection to the story for us? I'm not afraid of many things. I haven't encountered very many Jezebels. Thank you, Jesus. I have not encountered many Jezebels that made me that afraid. I've encountered some people that made me mad. And I've encountered some people that made me think that maybe my future was going to move this way or that way, but I've rarely been really afraid. So then, how do we get a handle on this? I do have fear for my children's future, and especially when I'm not around. That makes me afraid. So that's a place that I can go to think about with this. But as we moved through annual conference, I began to, the fear that I spoke about after the special general conference last February, the fear that I have for our church was reignited in me. And I think maybe that's the starting point for us to jump into this story. I fear for our wonderful United Methodist Church. I fear because I just don't know what is going to happen. You know, back in February, that general conference was held, and a really surprising direction was taken. The issue on the table was, in what ways are persons who describe themselves as LGBTQIA, how are they to be included in our fellowship? Will we allow them to be clergy? If God calls them, will we allow them to be clergy? Will we allow them to be married by our pastors and in our churches? And people have different ideas about that. And the plan that was adopted was so far beyond all of the restrictions that we've had in the past that many people just gasped. Even people who are not progressive just said, is this our church? Because now, if someone is accused of doing a same-gender marriage, and that accusation can come from just about anywhere, can come from anywhere in the United States. If I do a wedding for a same-gender couple, someone in North Carolina can hear about it or bring a charge against me. And now, when that charge is brought against me, my bishop's discretion in dealing with the matter is very much limited, Before the tradition of that conference happened, my bishop had a variety of pastoral responses available. Now he has to do is determine the facts. Did she really do it? Are there people who will say she did it? And if she did it, then what is the law? And the law says she's going to be suspended for a year without pay. Period. So much freedom disappeared in that moment. And what's going to happen to persons who are called to ordained ministry by God? They're not going to be allowed to be in ordained ministry. And what's going to happen to people who are already in ordained ministry, and that is known, they are going to be removed from ordained ministry. That's what the new plan says. And the reason that it becomes such a matter of deep concern is that our annual conference is so not in that place. Let me tell you about our annual conference in case you don't know. Fully 10 years ago, this annual conference, which encompasses all of Arizona, most of Nevada, and a little strip of California, not really anymore, our annual conference became a reconciling conference, which means that we went to conference as we did this last weekend, and the delegates voted. And they said, we are not going to let our sexual orientation get in the way of our ordaining clergy. Whoever comes that's called by God, affirmed by the church, and who meets the qualifications is going to be ordained. And our bishop took us to the side and said, I can't really officially say this, but I will protect you as much as I can if you feel that you must do same-gender marriages. And so as a result, we have many clergy who have done many same-gender marriages once it became legal. And we have persons serving in ministry they're serving in ministry doing a wonderful job, beloved by their churches, and they are married to persons of the same gender. And one of the things that happened at this annual conference was that they came out of the closet together. There was a moment in a worship service where first, all the Koreans came and stood and read, and all the Tongans, and then all of our LGBTQ clergy friends came and stood across the front of the gathering space, letting everybody know who they are. Do you see the problem? I mean, our western jurisdiction, which is all of the western part of the United States and includes Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, they're all part of the western jurisdiction, is also a reconciling group. And a few years ago, they elected a bishop who is a gay woman, a lesbian woman, who's married to another woman, and sent her to serve in the Mountain Sky Conference, where she has been faithfully serving ever since. Why are they doing this? They're doing this as a matter of civil disobedience because they believe that the discipline is wrong. They have prayerfully, faithfully searched the scriptures. They have used their tradition and their reason, and they have decided that our book of discipline is wrong, and that they will follow their conscience and not the book of discipline on this matter. Now, those are decisions made in faith, and faithfully by many people. But at the same time, there are many people, and many people in this room I know, who have faithfully searched the scriptures, or maybe haven't searched the scriptures, but think they know what they say. And they have prayed, and they've used their reason and experience and tradition and said, I agree with what's in the book of discipline and what's wrong with the traditional plan anyway. What I sense now is a straining at the seams of the big tent that is United Methodism. There have been all of these restrictions were placed into our discipline in 1972. They were never there before. And since then, we've been straining against each other. And now this big tent is threatening to pull apart. And one of the things we did at conference was we designated 10 teams people could join. Most of those teams have something to do with what do we do if the traditional plan really goes forward on January the 1st. And their teams include amicable separation, and they include, pulling away from the greater church. And so there are groups trying to explore, how is it that we deal with this? Can we still be together or not? And that makes me a little fearful. There's a group that say that what we're witnessing is a birthing pains, that this is the travail of birth, that a new church is being born, and we don't yet know what it looks like. And maybe it's a church that includes all of us, and maybe it's two churches, and maybe it's two loosely allied churches that somehow find a way to be together, but so much is at stake here. So if that is the fear that brings us to this story and gets us into the story, then it's important to notice a few things. The first thing to notice is that in the story of Elijah, God's not in the storms. God's not in the wind. God's not in the earthquake. God's not in the fire. God's in the quiet place. And that suggests to me that God's not in the controversies that you see all the time on umc.org and in the news, and where we're kind of throwing stones at one another and really having at it. There's a lot of that, especially on Facebook right now. God's not in that. The place that we'll find God is in the deep cave of our prayer closets, where we can get quiet enough and still enough to hear the voice of God. So I invite you in this season to be in your prayer closets a lot. One of the things we're doing as a conference, I mean, you can imagine, there's a lack of understanding of what we are to do. We're going to hold another conference on Saturday the 14th to deal further with these issues. These teams are working forward to see what alternatives might be. Be in prayer for all of that. And we are to have conversations in our local churches about these matters. Can we find a way to be together even though we do not agree on this one single issue? We've always been able to be together because we believe in Jesus Christ and Him who lived and died and was resurrected. He has been the center of us. And now we're being pulled to be more than one thing. Is that the right thing? So I'm going to lead classes in July and August, 4 session classes. I'm going to do 2 of them at different times in July. I'm going to repeat the classes in August. And we're going to use a little book that was actually prepared as a preparation for the general conference that has already passed us by. And I'm just using that as a way to open up conversation among us. I want all of you to come to one of them, please. I'll add more if we need to. And the intent is not to persuade you this way or that way, but to have conversations in which we say, these people believe this way, and these people believe this way. Where are we, and how might we live together? In addition to those classes, I will be holding open sessions on at least 2 Sundays. I'll do more if we would like. The first one will be on July the 14th after worship in the fellowship hall. You can bring whatever questions you have, and whether it's on this issue or other issues. And we'll just talk until we're done. And we'll do the same thing on the first Sunday of August. I'm available to you. Come talk to me about these things. Your lay delegates will be reporting on these matters in a couple of weeks, but it was so complicated that I went first to lay the groundwork. And then they'll come and talk to you about the legislation, almost all of which was trying in one way or another to undo some part of the traditional plan or to define a response to the traditional plan. And remember that it's in the quiet, the deep cave of your prayer closet that you're most likely to hear the voice of God. And the question that you're most likely to hear in that deep prayer closet is this one.